Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I was cleaning my husband Ethan's office when I found a thick envelope hidden inside his desk drawer. At first, I thought it was something work-related, maybe contracts or financial papers. But when I opened it, my heart nearly stopped. Inside were photos of me. Some were of me shopping, others at my favorite cafe, one of me sitting in my car at a red light. The strangest part? I didn't recognize any of them. They weren't selfies, and Ethan hadn't taken them. They were taken from a distance, like someone had been following me. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Who had taken these? And why were they in Ethan's drawer? I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe he'd hired a photographer for a surprise gift, some kind of collage of my daily life. That thought eased my nerves, until I flipped to the last page. There, neatly clipped to the stack, was a business card. A private investigator's business card. I stared at the card in disbelief. Ethan had hired someone to follow me. The man I loved, the man I trusted completely, had been secretly tracking my every move. My hands shook as I dialed the number on the card. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. Henderson Investigations. I hung up immediately. What was I even doing? I needed to talk to Ethan first. That night, I forced myself to act normal during dinner. Ethan was his usual charming self, telling me about his day at work, laughing at my stories. But I could barely eat. The food felt like sand in my mouth. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Ethan, have you ever hired a private investigator? He froze for just a second, so quick that if I hadn't been watching him closely, I might have missed it. But I saw it. And in that moment, I knew. He was hiding something. Ethan's expression softened. Why would I do that? What's going on, sweetheart? I wanted to believe him. I really did. But I couldn't ignore the evidence. I pulled the envelope from my bag and slid it across the table. Then explained these. He picked up the photos, flipping through them with unreadable eyes. Then, to my absolute shock, he smiled. I can explain, he said. It's not what you think. Oh, really? I snapped. Because it looks like my husband doesn't trust me and decided to spy on me. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's not like that. I did this for us, not because I don't trust you. For us. I scoffed. Ethan, do you hear yourself? How does invading my privacy help our marriage? He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. Please, just let me explain. I folded my arms. I'm listening. And then Ethan told me something that changed everything. Ethan leaned forward, lowering his voice like he was afraid someone else might hear. I did this because I was worried about you. I frowned. Worried? About what? He exhaled slowly. You've been acting different lately. Distracted. You go places without telling me. You get calls and texts you don't mention. And then last month, money went missing from our joint account. I started wondering if maybe. I gasped. You thought I was cheating on you? He shook his head. No, I didn't want to think that. But I was scared, okay? I didn't know what else to do. So I hired someone to check, just to make sure everything was fine. I was speechless. He had no proof, no real reason to doubt me, just his own paranoia. And instead of talking to me, he'd hired a stranger to track me like I was a suspect in some crime. Ethan, I said, my voice shaking, if you really loved me, you would have just asked me. Chapter 5, I walk away. But not for long. I didn't know what hurt more, his lack of trust or the fact that he thought this was reasonable. I stood up from the table. I need space. He looked panicked. Please, don't go. But I grabbed my bag and walked out. I didn't go far. Just to a hotel down the street. I needed to think. But as I sat in the quiet room, staring at the city lights outside the window, I felt something nagging at me. Ethan's explanation made sense, too much sense. But something about those photos, the way they were taken, it didn't add up. I picked up my phone and did something I never thought I'd do. I called the private investigator. When the phone rang through to Henderson Investigations, I felt a wave of panic. Was I really doing this? Calling the person who had been secretly following me? But I had to know the truth. Hello? The voice on the other end sounded neutral, almost too professional. Hi, I'm calling about the case you were hired for. The one involving Ethan Bennett. There was a slight pause. Ah, Mrs. Bennett. Yes, I remember the case. I need to know everything. I said, my voice wavering. Why did he hire you? What exactly did you find out? Mrs. Bennett, the investigator said slowly. I'm afraid I can't share details about the case. That's confidential. I could hear the professionalism in his tone, but I pushed harder. I'm his wife. If he hired you to spy on me, I deserve to know what you've been doing. Another pause. Then he sighed. All right, I'll tell you, but understand, this was never personal. I just do my job. His words sent chills through me as I braced myself for the truth. The investigator went on to explain that Ethan had been suspicious of me for months. He'd noticed my late nights, my phone calls, and our recent distance. As he recounted the details, it became clear that Ethan's fears were rooted in something deeper than I could have imagined. The investigator described how he'd followed me everywhere, from work to weekend getaways. He even mentioned the moment when I'd gone to a coffee shop, where I'd run into an old friend. We took a few pictures from across the street, he said, almost matter-of-factly. I couldn't believe it. Ethan had gone so far as to hire someone to follow me during a casual encounter with a friend? It felt like an invasion of every part of my life. What else did you find out? I asked, my voice trembling. The investigator hesitated. There were things that might not have been relevant to the case, but were odd nonetheless. I'd recommend you speak directly to your husband. I knew then that I had to confront Ethan again, but now I was more determined to uncover everything. The next morning, I called Ethan. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I needed answers, and the time for secrets was over. Ethan, I said, my voice calm but firm. We need to talk. He sounded surprised, his voice laced with guilt. I didn't think you'd be ready to talk so soon. I'm not just ready, I replied. I need to understand why you couldn't come to me with your fears. Why you chose to spy on me instead. There was silence on the other end. I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I was scared, okay? I didn't want to lose you. I could hear the raw emotion in his voice, but it wasn't enough to undo the damage. You don't trust me, Ethan, and that's not something we can fix overnight. He begged me to come home, but the damage was done. I wasn't sure if I could ever look at him the same way again. That evening, I met Ethan at our house. The tension was unbearable. We sat down in the living room, avoiding each other's gaze. I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan said, his eyes filled with regret. I just felt like I was losing you, and I didn't know how to handle it. I took a deep breath, the weight of his words pressing on my chest. Ethan, you don't handle trust issues by hiring someone to follow me. That's betrayal. You had no right. He reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. I don't know if I can forgive you for this. He looked at me, tears starting to well up in his eyes. I don't know if I can forgive myself, either. I didn't say anything. What could I say? His actions had shattered everything I believed about our relationship. Over the next few weeks, I tried to navigate the wreckage of my marriage. I couldn't escape the feeling of betrayal, and every time I looked at Ethan, I saw the man who had hired a stranger to watch me. It felt like our entire relationship had been a lie, built on the foundation of his doubt and paranoia. The intimacy we once shared had vanished, replaced by a cold silence that filled every room we were in. Ethan did everything he could to make it right, apologizing, trying to explain, even asking me to go to couples counseling. But the trust was gone. How could I ever believe him again? It was clear that something had to change. And deep down, I knew it wasn't just Ethan who needed to make changes. I had to decide what was best for me, even if it meant walking away. After weeks of sleepless nights, I finally made the decision to step away from everything. I didn't want to live in a marriage filled with suspicion and fear. I needed space to breathe, to think clearly. I rented a small apartment not far from the house. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, my own place to find peace, to regain some semblance of control. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could think for myself. I spent my days reflecting on everything, on how things had changed, how Ethan had changed. It was impossible not to wonder what had caused him to spiral into such irrational behavior. Was it insecurity? Fear? Or was there something darker going on that he wasn't telling me? I began to realize that I needed to understand why he had done this. The answers were far from simple, but I wasn't ready to give up just yet. The days in my apartment were both peaceful and overwhelming. I'd started reading again, spending time with old friends, trying to re-establish some parts of myself that had faded away in the chaos of our marriage. But there was still one thing gnawing at me. Why did Ethan feel so compelled to hire someone to spy on me? It wasn't just about his lack of trust. Something was off. It felt like he was hiding something even bigger. But what? I decided to confront him again, not just about the spying, but about everything. All the secrets I felt he'd been keeping from me, all the little things that didn't add up. I reached for my phone and texted him. We need to talk again. I need answers. Within seconds, he called me. His voice sounded desperate. Please, just give me a chance to explain. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this than he was letting on. We met at a small park, away from our home. It was quiet there, just the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. Ethan, I need to know everything, I said, not wasting any time. I can't move forward without the full truth. He looked at me for a long time, his face a mix of guilt and frustration. Finally, he spoke. There's something you don't know. Something I should have told you from the start. I leaned forward, holding my breath. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I wasn't just worried about you, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I was scared because of something I found. Something that changed everything. I couldn't believe my ears. What do you mean? What did you find? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. I found out about your past. Things you hadn't told me. And it made me question everything. My heart dropped. What was he talking about? What past was he referring to? Ethan, you need to explain yourself, I demanded, my voice trembling. He took a deep breath. Before we met, you had a history with someone I didn't know about. And I was terrified it would come back to haunt us. The shock hit me like a wave. I had never hidden anything from Ethan. So what was he talking about? Ethan's revelation left me speechless. I had no idea what he was referring to. I tried to process his words, but my mind was spinning. I don't understand, I said, my voice cracking. Who are you talking about? What history? He stared at me, his eyes clouded with confusion. You really don't remember? I shook my head. Ethan, I've always been honest with you. I don't have a secret past. There's nothing you need to worry about. But he wouldn't let it go. I've seen the evidence. There were things, documents, records, that made me think I didn't know you at all. My blood ran cold. What was he talking about? Had he found something about me that I hadn't even known existed? You've been keeping secrets from me, he continued, his voice rising. I had to protect myself, to make sure I wasn't being lied to again. I shook my head, feeling the ground shift beneath me. I had always trusted Ethan, but now I realized how much he didn't trust me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The more I thought about Ethan's words, the more confused I became. What was he talking about? What evidence had he seen that I didn't even know about? The next day, I decided to investigate on my own. I knew I needed to confront whatever it was that had caused this deep mistrust in my marriage. I returned to our home, hoping to find something that could explain Ethan's behavior. As I walked through the rooms, everything felt foreign to me. The house that had once been filled with love now felt like a prison. I went to his office, the one where I discovered the photos of me. I searched through his papers, through every drawer, until I found something, an old file, buried beneath other documents. When I opened it, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a report, a detailed report about me. I stared at the report in disbelief. It was as though my entire life had been analyzed and dissected by someone else. The file contained details about my family, my childhood, my past relationships, things I had never shared with anyone except my closest friends. How did Ethan get this information? I felt a mix of anger, confusion, and betrayal surge through me. I flipped through the pages, each one revealing more about me than I'd ever thought possible. But the final page was the most shocking. It contained the name of someone I hadn't thought about in years, David. David was an ex-boyfriend, someone I'd been deeply involved with in college. But that was long before Ethan and I had met, and I had never once brought him up. Ethan had somehow found out about David, and now it made sense why he was so paranoid. He hadn't just been worried about me. He'd been haunted by a ghost from my past. The realization hit me hard. I had thought I'd moved on from my past, but it was clear that Ethan hadn't. David had been a part of my life that I'd never expected to resurface, but now it was coming back to haunt me. I had to confront Ethan about it. I couldn't continue living with this weight hanging over us. I called him, my voice calm but filled with determination. We need to talk, I said. He agreed to meet me at our house, and I arrived early, pacing back and forth in front of the door. My mind was racing, and my heart felt heavy. What would he say when I showed him the report? Would he finally understand how deeply his actions had hurt me? When Ethan walked through the door, I didn't waste any time. Explain this, I said, holding up the report in front of him. His face went pale. He knew exactly what it was. I wasn't trying to hurt you, he said, his voice shaky. I was just so scared that if your past caught up with you, it would ruin everything we have. You invaded my privacy, Ethan. You hired a private investigator to spy on me, I said, unable to hide the anger in my voice. I thought I was protecting us, he said, his eyes filled with regret. But I see now that I just made everything worse. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of his words hanging between us. I tried to understand his perspective, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how much damage had been done. Ethan wasn't just questioning my loyalty. He was questioning the very essence of who I was. And in doing so, he had torn apart the trust that we'd spent years building. I never wanted to hurt you, Ethan said again, his voice cracking. But I see now that I've done exactly that. Ethan, you don't trust me, I whispered. And without trust, there's no relationship. I don't know if I can keep doing this. He reached out to me, his hand trembling. Please, don't leave me. I'll do anything to fix this. I pulled away from him. I don't know if I can believe you anymore. His face crumpled in pain, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the vulnerability behind the man I had once loved. That night, I stayed in the guest room. I couldn't bring myself to sleep in our bed after everything that had happened. The air felt thick with unspoken words, and the distance between us felt like an insurmountable wall. As I lay in the darkness, I replayed the events over and over in my mind. Ethan's actions had been extreme, but his fears were rooted in something real. He hadn't trusted me, but his trust issues ran deeper than I had realized. The more I thought about it, the more I understood that his insecurities were about more than just David or the past. Ethan had always been a man who needed control, and when he felt like he was losing it, he panicked. The private investigator wasn't just about surveillance. It was his way of trying to regain some power over the situation. But that wasn't how love worked. And I couldn't keep living in a relationship where trust was always in question. The next morning, I sat Ethan down in the living room. He looked at me with a mixture of hope and fear in his eyes. He was waiting for me to make the next move, but I had already made my decision. Ethan, I began softly, I've thought long and hard about this, and I don't think we can fix this. His eyes widened, and his voice cracked. What do you mean? Please, just give me another chance. I shook my head. I don't know if I can forgive you for what you've done. The trust is gone, and I can't keep pretending that everything's okay. Ethan's face fell, and for the first time, I saw how lost he truly was. But I knew this was the only way forward, for both of us. I need to let go, I whispered, and I think you do too. With that, I stood up, leaving him there in the silence of our home. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had to move on, even if it meant walking away from everything I had ever known. The days after my decision were a blur of emotions. I packed my things slowly, each item a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. Ethan tried to reach out, leaving me messages, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. There was no more pretending, no more hoping things could go back to how they once were. The hardest part was seeing him on that final day as I took the last of my belongings. His face was drained of color, his eyes red from the sleepless nights. Please, just talk to me, he begged. I'll fix it, I swear. But there was nothing left to fix. Trust had been shattered beyond repair. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of his insecurities, and I couldn't ignore the pain of being constantly surveilled. I'm sorry, Ethan, I said softly, closing the door behind me. I need to find myself again. I knew it was the right decision, but my heart ached as I walked away. It wasn't easy. I spent the next few months healing, physically, mentally, and emotionally. I took time off from work, focusing on reconnecting with old friends, finding hobbies that brought me peace, and rediscovering the person I had lost in the chaos of my marriage. I started therapy, not just to process what had happened with Ethan, but to work through my own issues. I needed to understand why I had stayed in a relationship that was so filled with doubt and fear. As time passed, I began to feel stronger, more confident in who I was. The woman who had been stalked by suspicion was starting to fade away, replaced by someone who was in control of her own life once more. But there were still moments when Ethan's face haunted me, when the pain of his betrayal resurfaced. I had to remind myself that I was doing what was best for me, no matter how hard it was. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend at a local coffee shop. It was someone I hadn't seen in years, someone I had once shared my life with before everything got so complicated. We exchanged pleasantries, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. As we caught up, I realized how much I had been missing in my life. Friendships, laughter, and the joy of living without fear. I had been so wrapped up in my marriage and Ethan's trust issues that I had lost sight of everything else. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about how far I'd come. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the same woman who had been married to Ethan. She was stronger, more self-assured, and ready to take on whatever the future held. I was learning how to live again, and it felt like freedom. A week later, I received a letter in the mail from Ethan. It was a simple envelope, no return address. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized his handwriting on the front. I hesitated before opening it, unsure of what I would find. Inside, there was a single piece of paper covered in his careful, shaky handwriting. "I don't expect you to forgive me," it began, "but I want you to know that I am truly sorry for what I did. I've spent so much time trying to control everything around me that I lost sight of the one thing I should have been protecting: you. I never meant to hurt you, and I regret every moment I spent questioning your loyalty. I see now that my fears weren't just about you, but about myself. I was afraid of losing you, but I ended up pushing you away. I hope you find happiness and peace, wherever that may be. I'll always love you." Tears welled up in my eyes as I read his words. They were heartfelt, but they came too late. I knew this was the closure I needed, but I also knew that nothing would change the fact that I had to let go. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. I didn't need to respond. The healing was already happening, and I was ready to move forward. In the months that followed, I continued to grow. I focused on building my career, something I had put on hold during my marriage. I rediscovered passions I had forgotten about, like painting and traveling, and I surrounded myself with people who cared for me without conditions. I found a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. No longer tethered to the weight of Ethan's actions, I could finally breathe deeply and live freely. It was empowering to know that I didn't need anyone to complete me, that I was whole on my own. The mistakes of the past, the betrayal, and the heartache had all shaped me into a stronger, more resilient person. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I was ready for whatever came next. A year later, I found myself standing at the edge of something new. I had met someone, a man who truly saw me, who didn't come with hidden agendas or broken trust. We moved slowly, learning about each other, and I could feel the difference in this relationship. This time, there was no fear, no surveillance. There was only openness, laughter, and genuine connection. And as we walked hand in hand into the future, I realized that this was what I had been searching for all along: peace. I had come a long way from the woman who had been stalked by suspicion and betrayal. I had found my strength, and I knew that I was capable of anything. The past no longer defined me. It had taught me valuable lessons, but it didn't control me. I was ready for whatever came next, knowing that I could handle it, because I had finally learned to trust myself. As time went on, I found myself slowly rebuilding trust, not only with others, but also with myself. It wasn't something that happened overnight, but every day was a step in the right direction. The man I was seeing now, Jacob, had been patient, kind, and understanding. We didn't rush into anything. Instead, we took our time, learning about each other, respecting boundaries, and allowing trust to grow naturally. It felt strange at first, letting someone into my life after everything that had happened. I had learned to guard my heart, to keep a part of me hidden, just in case. But Jacob made it easy to be open. He didn't pressure me. He didn't judge me. He just accepted me for who I was, flaws and all. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this world. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to thrive. One afternoon, out of the blue, I received a call from Ethan. I hadn't spoken to him in months, and I wasn't sure I was ready for a conversation with him. But part of me knew that I needed closure, once and for all. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe. As soon as I saw him, I noticed how different he seemed. His eyes were tired, the weight of the past few months heavy on his shoulders. He had lost the confident air he once carried, and now, all that remained was a man seeking redemption. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Ethan said, his voice low. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am for everything I did. For the spying, the mistrust, all of it." I nodded, my heart still guarded but open. "Ethan, I've moved on. I've forgiven you, but that doesn't mean I'm going back. I need to focus on my own life now. I've found peace in a way I never thought possible." He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I see that now. I'm glad you're okay. I never wanted to ruin your happiness. I took a deep breath. I think we both needed this. I needed to forgive you, and you needed to forgive yourself. But we're both on different paths now, and that's okay. It was a quiet moment, but a powerful one. Finally, we were both free from the chains of our past. Jacob and I continued to grow closer, and though it wasn't without challenges, I felt an inner peace that I had never experienced in my previous relationship. We made plans for the future, trips, dreams, aspirations, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I had learned to trust again, but more importantly, I had learned to trust myself. I wasn't the same woman I had been when I walked away from Ethan. I was stronger, wiser, and more self-assured. And as I looked back on everything that had happened, I realized that I wouldn't change a thing. The pain, the betrayal, and the heartbreak had all taught me valuable lessons. I had learned the importance of self-love, of boundaries, and of never compromising who I was for anyone else. I didn't need to be saved. I had saved myself. A year later, as Jacob and I stood together on a beautiful beach, watching the sunset, I realized just how far I had come. The woman who had once been lost in a whirlwind of lies, betrayal, and mistrust was now standing tall, full of hope and excitement for the future. We had talked about marriage, about building a life together, but we had agreed to take things one step at a time. The trust we had was built on honesty and respect, not fear or suspicion. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I was walking towards something, a future that was mine to shape. "I love you," Jacob said, taking my hand gently. "I love you too," I replied, my heart full. "And I'm ready for whatever comes next." As we stood there, watching the waves crash against the shore, I knew that the past was behind me. I had found my strength, my voice, and most importantly, my peace. The future was wide open, and I was ready to embrace it fully. Thank you for listening to my story until now. If you like the video, please support it by subscribing and liking.